Yeah, so it should be, yeah, it should be good to go.
Good evening. Welcome to Regent College. We are delighted to be together this evening. My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent and this year's evening public lecture coordinator. Welcome to all of you who are here with us in person, and welcome to all of you who join us online anywhere in the world you may be. Welcome from Vancouver, this beautiful land that we call home, where we live, work, study, and worship on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish people. Such a blessing to call this home, this land, home. Tonight we have a great lecture, but if you need to exit this room for whatever reason, please be mindful of the sliding door opening and closing, as we are trying to prevent any disruption to a lecture tonight. In the same way, if you have any electronic device that can produce any sound, please put it in silent, as we are trying to prevent disruptions to our lecture as well. Lastly, those of you joining us in person, please be aware that we are live streaming and recording this session under the conditions spelled out in the public notice posted on the door as you entered both Regent and this room. At this point, I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Paul Spilsbury. He is our academic dean and professor of New Testament. Professor Spilsbury.
Thank you. Thank you, Pablo. Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be with you here tonight on this occasion of our evening public lecture, and especially it's wonderful to have Professor Lynn Cohick with us this evening, and all of you along as well. I want to just remind you of our format. We will have a lecture that will go for about an hour or so, after which we will have an opportunity for conversation with Professor Cohick. For those of you who are here, we have microphones that have been set up. Please go to one of the microphones so that you can be well heard, and you will also be recorded, so just be aware of that. And for those of you who are online, you can email your comments or questions to questions@regent-college.edu, and our evening will conclude around 9 p.m. or so, at which time Professor Cohick will be available in the bookstore to chat and to sign books if you would like to purchase one, or if you've got one of her books with you and you want to get it specially noted. So let me put my glasses back on. Make sure I get the facts. It is a delight to introduce our speaker this evening. Professor Lynn Cohick holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She is Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Director of the Houston Theological Seminary at Houston Christian University. As I'm sure you all know, she's a highly respected scholar and sought-after speaker who has authored, co-authored, edited, or co-edited over 50 works. That's a lot. Including commentaries on Philippians and Ephesians and the book Women in the World of Earliest Christians, which came out in 2009. She speaks on a wide range of New Testament topics, including discoursing on women in the church and in the New Testament, and exploring issues related to the relationship between Jews and Christians. Professor Cohick is president of the Institute of Biblical Research. She's been coming to Regent since 2013, which is a good amount of time, more than 10 years. How many times would you say, Lynn, in that? Half a dozen times? Easily. Teaching New Testament foundations, all kinds of other courses. And this week is with us teaching her course entitled Women in the New Testament and Early Church. And this evening, though, we are hearing some of her most current work, and this lecture this evening is called Visual Record, Christian Women Depicted in Church Art. We're looking forward to this. Please welcome her as she comes.
Well, thank you so much for coming out this evening, and for those of you on Zoom for tuning in. I'm grateful to Regent College for inviting me to present this topic to you, and I look forward to the conversation that we'll have when I'm finished showing you my slides. This talk tonight is part of a project that I've been working on for the last 2 years or so. The Visual Museum of Women in Christianity is a project that was started through a grant from the Luce Foundation, and it was part of a group. I worked with Dr. Sandra Glahn, who is at Dallas Theological Seminary, and Dr. George Kalantzis, who is at Wheaton College, and we worked on a project to present pictures of artwork of women in the church. They could be biblical women, Old and New Testament, or later years in the church. If you'd like more information, and I drew also many of the photos that you'll see today from the Visual Museum, and you can access that online, visualmuseum.gallery/gallery. There's also a podcast series that talks more about, more in detail about several of the women I'll touch on tonight. And you can access that through the podcast, The Alabaster Jar. So, we'll dive in. We're going to journey back into church history, looking at its art, from the catacombs of Rome to the mosaics of Ravenna, to the frescoes and sculptures of medieval cathedrals. And what we'll see is the legacy of women's influence and their piety that shaped the church. Some of these women gave their lives as martyrs. Others wrote poetry and devotional books. Some challenged impious leaders. Others fed the poor and cared for the sick. Their faithfulness enriches our own discipleship, and it reminds us that we are part of this great cloud of witnesses. What do we find in the visual record of women in Christianity? I'm going to suggest 3 things we can be alert to. We will see stories of faithfulness. We will see examples of courage. And we will see evidence of leadership in theology and in politics. Christianity starts with the birth of Jesus. That's our Christmas story. And what you see now on the screen is one of the earliest depictions of Mary and Jesus in the catacomb of Priscilla. One of the earliest depictions of Jesus' earthly family. Here's another picture of that. Mary's discipleship is perhaps best known from the Christmas story, but she is a model disciple as she instructs those who are serving in the wedding in Cana. She instructs them to do as he says, right? Do as Jesus says. She doesn't flee from the cross, but she stays to the end. And the descent from the cross, when they take Jesus' body off the cross, sometimes called the deposition, that is memorialized in medieval and Renaissance art. Perhaps some of you have traveled to Rome and into the Vatican, into St. Peter's, and have seen Michelangelo's Pietà. It's like the marble is living. It's so compelling and beautiful. So Mary is remembered in that way, but she's also remembered, and here we have an example of an illuminated manuscript of Pentecost. Here's the picture of Pentecost, and you see Mary as a central figure in Pentecost. She was there at the birth of Jesus, That doesn't surprise us. But she was also there at the birth of his church. And this is celebrated in art numerous times up through the, I'm going up through the Renaissance before the Reformation. This particular piece of art is from the University of Glasgow's library in their special collections department. And Ludolf of Saxony has a 4-volume Life of Christ with 140 illuminated illustrations. This being one of them. For more, if you're interested in more information about, let's say, illuminated manuscripts and the medieval period as it relates to depicting women, I'd recommend Grace Hammond's work, Jesus Through Medieval Eyes. Just came out from Zondervan in 2023. It's a beautiful book. Grace Hammond, Jesus Through Medieval Eyes. But it wasn't just Mary, mother of Jesus Christ, but also Mary Magdalene as a very important figure in art. A book that just came out on Mary Magdalene called Mary Magdalene, Visual History in 2023, was written by Diane Apostolos Capadonna. Mary is extensively depicted in art, but in the medieval period and later, her legend grew. Her biblical history, the stories that we have in the Bible, were morphed or tangled together, and certainly her life after Jesus' resurrection was expanded. It was told about. We'll look at that. But first, the biblical story. We meet Mary Magdalene in Luke chapter 8. She is one of several women that joins Jesus' group. She was healed of 7 demons. We next see her in the time of the cross, there at the base of the cross. In this particular picture, you see Mary and also a few other female disciples, and John, the beloved disciple. Mary Magdalene is clutching the bottom of the cross, almost holding it up, it appears. She has a red garment on and also red hair. She often is depicted in art as wearing red and having long, often red hair. It may be that the red in her garment is to evoke caritas, or love. It can be symbolized by red. Mary, the mother of Jesus, sometimes is also clothed in red or in blue, which is the color of heaven. Then we have Mary depicted in the deposition as Jesus is taken down from the cross. This moment in the narrative of Jesus' death and resurrection, you see on the slide the text that mentions it, but it's not emphasized in any kind of detail. But the art pulls out the drama and pathos of this moment time and again. I'll show you an earlier depiction of Mary, and there you see her in the corner in her red garment with her long red hair in a state of great mourning. Mary also greets Christ at the resurrection. This is the famous "Do not touch me, noli me tangere," that is depicted extensively in the art. It's where Jesus meets her at in the garden, and he asks her why she's crying, and she says, if you're the gardener, have you taken Jesus' body so that take me there so I may get him? And Jesus responds to her statement with her name, Mary. And that's when she recognizes who Jesus is and cries out, Rabboni, or our teacher. And Jesus responds, do not hold on to me. Do not clutch me. You're trying to keep me here. For I have not ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers. And then she does, and she testifies, I have seen the Lord. This is a very, as I said, this is depicted extensively, including, do you notice here, Jesus is holding a hoe, a gardener's utensil. Sometimes he's even depicted in the garb of a gardener. But she is commissioned to go, and thus for Mary Magdalene, she was known by some of the church fathers as the apostle to the apostles. She is commanded by Jesus to go and tell. One final picture. These are just a variety of pictures, as you can see from the artist's perspective, very different ways of depicting this moment. What I want to drive home is how important this moment is for the church. But then we move beyond this moment, and there is an early tradition that Mary preached before Emperor Tiberius. So here's how the story goes. And you can see this particular painting in the Russian Orthodox Church of St. Mary Magdalene, which is at Gethsemane. So the tradition has it that she traveled to Rome. This particular tradition has it that she traveled to Rome after the resurrection. She preached and she helped the church there. And she was invited to a banquet that Caesar Tiberius was attending, and she preached to him. And she told him how awful Pilate did at his job at the trial. And she confirmed the resurrection that she saw with her own eyes, and she held an egg up to tell him this is a symbol of new life. Tiberius said he believed the resurrection if the egg turned red. Well, if you look closely in her hand, the egg is red. I don't know if Tiberius converted, but this particular tradition is linked to a passage in Romans chapter 16, verse 6, where Paul asks the Roman Christians to greet Mary, who has worked among you. She traveled the Mediterranean, and then she returned to Jerusalem, and then she traveled with John, the disciple, and Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, traveled with them to Ephesus, where she lived with them. So if you visit Ephesus today, you will find sites that claim that these three were lived there. It's claimed that she helped John write his gospel, and that she also wrote her own, which we don't have. But later medieval depictions do show her as an author. That's one traditional extension of Mary's life. But there is another one that I want to talk about that is perhaps even more pertinent to our purposes. This is a statue done by Donatello that I find so powerful, captivating, haunting. Look, this Mary is emaciated and yet muscular, and her gaze is almost as though she's not thinking at all about earthly matters. How did we get to this Mary? What is the connection here? Well, it happens in a couple of ways. First of all, from the biblical text, as I mentioned to you, Mary Magdalene's story begins in Luke 8. But there are, right around like 200 with Tertullian, he starts to connect Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons were cast, with the sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet in Luke 7. And then that story is connected and is seen to be the same as the stories at the end of the Gospels of Mark and Matthew and John, where during Jesus' Passion Week, he has dinner with Martha and Mary of Bethany, this is John 12, or unnamed woman at Simon the leper's house in Bethany. And those three tellings of the story are said to be the same as Luke's telling of the sinful woman, even though the stories themselves are very different. The similarity is a jar of perfume that is poured out. And so all of those stories are put together. And the Mary of Bethany is identified as the Mary Magdalene, which means Mary Magdalene is the same as Mary of Bethany, and thus Mary Magdalene is the sister of Martha and the brother of Lazarus. So you have three women, Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed woman in Luke 7, and they are all pulled together, I think wrongly, by the church fathers. And eventually then, around 500, that becomes the position going forward. The woman in Luke 7 is identified as a sinner. She's not, it's not clear what her sin was. Luke doesn't tell us. He doesn't claim that it is sexual sin. He does know the word for prostitute. He uses that later in Luke 15 when he's talking about the actions of the prodigal son, what the prodigal son does when he leaves his father. So this woman in Luke 7 is a sinner, according to Simon the Pharisee, but she does not outwardly present as a prostitute. Otherwise, Jesus would know that she was one, whereas Simon believes it takes a prophetic insight to know that she's a sinner, if you read the story carefully. Anyway, the stories, I'll cut to the chase. The stories themselves lead to an assumption, conclusion, that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. That's how she got her money, that she was sexually immoral, and it was that was equated with these 7 demons that were driven out of her. Right? So all of that then wraps up together, and we're going to add a few other things to it, but that's how you get to this penitent Mary. She was always in a posture of repentance for her past sexual sins. That's not all of her. There's also some very powerful ways that she's understood, but this is one trajectory. The reason that Mary has such long hair that you continue to see in so many of the works of art comes from this figure, who is completely covered in her own hair. And you can see in the scroll that she is holding, it says, as you can see on the screen, "Do not despair, you who are accustomed to sin, but do penance, following my example." Now, penance was highly valued, so if you assumed all those things about Mary, then her posture of penance was a really godly and good thing to do. So she's valued for that. But her long hair and all of that comes from a conflation of a story of another woman, Mary of Egypt, who was, in this story, she did live a very sexually promiscuous life in Alexandria, and then she moved to Jerusalem, and while she was there, she was converted, right about the area of the Holy Sepulchre. She heard a voice telling her, at this point, go across the Jordan. So she did. She only had 3 loaves of bread. But she lived out there in the wilderness. She gathered her food for years and years and years. Her clothes wore out. But God wouldn't let her be immoral, so her hair grew out long enough to cover her. Thus, the long hair. She lived around 350 or so, and she told her story to a monk who was there in Palestine. He met her in the desert, and he gave her his cloak, although she was covered with her hair, but he still wanted to cover her more. He returned the next year to see her and to give her Holy Communion on Holy Thursday. She said, and when he was there to greet her, she walked across the Jordan on top of the water, met him, had communion, walked back on top of the water, having decided that she would see him again same time next year. He comes back next year, and he finds that she died. And there's an inscription in the sand that says she died right after they had enjoyed communion. A lion was walking by, probably related to Aslan, and helped bury the body. So this is a story that continued, that kind of folded into Mary Magdalene. And this also then, it grows. Right? So we have, in one of the scenes, let me just take you back here, and you can see the various scenes in this artwork. And one of those, I'll do a close-up now, it's Mary preaching. So one thing that develops around the 1200s is what's called the Golden Legend, and that pulls together lots of these stories about Mary Magdalene's work as a preacher and miracle worker in the area of France. And so she's well known in that area. She's also well known in the German-speaking areas. I mean, she's incredibly important. She's a incredibly important figure to think with as the writers of this time and the artists of this time think about how to live piously as they are understanding it. There's one final picture, and this describes one of the traditions of Mary where she lived in a cave, but each day she rose up and met the angels. She was elevated each day from her hut there in La Sainte-Baume. And this was a pilgrimage site for both laity and clerics. You see at the bottom, Jesus is receiving her soul as she passes. In the early modern period, Mary Magdalene could be seen as a symbol of descending the sacraments for the Catholics and as a penitent sinner for the Protestants. So I'm not asking you to believe these legends like they actually happened. What I'm saying is that Mary Magdalene was a very powerful and influential figure in the church. This is Diane Apostolos Capadonna, who writes, Mary has come to represent visually and spiritually the fullness of the human experience in her journey from sinner to witness to saint. Well, we have looked at Mary, the mother of Jesus, or I could say Mary Theotokos, the mother of God, and Mary Magdalene. We're going to shift now into the 2nd and 3rd centuries as we look at the catacombs. Here you see Jonah getting tossed out of a boat, being ready to be swallowed by the sea creature. This is a very common story that's depicted in the catacombs. We also have, and you can see here, the catacombs are not a place where Christians hide from the Romans. Everybody knew that the Christians were there. It's a place where you buried your dead, and we have Jewish burial sites there and pagan burial sites. But the Christians would return, especially if there were martyrs who were buried there. And we also find, and we'll see this, funerary meal depictions. Everything that I say about catacombs will have like 5 or 6 or 10 different interpretations. So it's a fascinating study, but we continue to learn more. There are 2 important figures in the catacombs as it relates to Christian art, but are also typical pagan presentations. One is the shepherd. The shepherd is related to Hermes, who's the guide of the underworld. But of course, we know Jesus as the good shepherd. And Jesus is regularly depicted, maybe with a lamb or even a ram on his shoulders. And then we have the Aaron's figure, this pose and prayer. Here's another picture of that same Aaron's figure. It is a popular figure in antiquity. It typically is shown as a woman, although there are times when men are shown in this posture. We could see this particular, which is from the Priscilla catacombs. It's possible that this is a picture of the woman herself who is buried there, and on one side you have a depiction of her marriage, and on the other side of her as a mother bearing a child. It's possible. Yeah, we don't know. But one of the most impressive spaces in the Priscilla catacombs is the Greek chapel. It is possible, an argument is being made, that this is where the bones of the martyr Prisca, and Prisca of the biblical period, although we have Priscas or Priscillas from generations after that, who may also have been martyred and then their bones kept here. Why I'm showing you this is if you look to the end of this aisleway, the second arch, which is painted kind of orange, in that is this picture, the Fractio Panis, the breaking of the bread, one of the most well-known pictures in the catacombs. And what do we see here? Well, once again, we've got 3 or 4 tightly held, strongly held positions that are mutually exclusive. Is this Eucharist? And if this is Eucharist, is this all men with one woman, or is this all women? Does it indicate just how back in these early times you had the bishop or the priest who gave communion to the other men and a woman? Or is it the case that you have the fresco of all women who are doing Eucharist themselves? This is a very important question as it relates to the Catholic Church. And there's debate, but what if it's not Eucharist at all? What if it is simply a meal? And what would these meals look like? I'll give you another picture here of the meal scene. These are very common throughout the catacombs, men and women, both with Christian and in pagan burials. Like I said, it could be Eucharist, sacramental, but it could be the heavenly banquet. What if it's the promised, marriage supper of the Lamb that is depicted here? Or what if it is just a memorial meal that the Christians had in celebrating their deceased relatives? We don't know, there doesn't seem to appear any evidence other than an interpretation of this artwork for any evidence that the Christians did have meals down there. There's no architectural evidence. We know they had meals that celebrated their dead loved ones, but no evidence that it was held underground. The meals celebrating their dead relatives could be lively affairs, not solemn ones, and at least in this case, it looks pretty jovial. People are talking with each other, and that could fit a regular funerary meal scenario. Maybe what we're looking at is symbolic, that these, especially here when you have the 7 figures and the 7 baskets, are these pushing us to see paradise? So there's an eschatological component. Yeah. What I would just like to say is that in sum, the catacomb art depicts women and men together doing whatever it is that they're doing. And it's not a sequestered male and female on different sides of the room. They're worshiping together. They're praying together. And it's in a context of death, of burial. We're going to stay in the 2nd century, but move now to martyrs. We have maybe about the same number of female martyrs as male martyrs. So this was not something just a few women did and mostly men, but you had both men and women martyred for the faith. And the first martyr female is named Thecla. And so you see a seal, or not a seal, but like a piece of art, a rondelle, from about the 5th century. And her story itself is told early 2nd century. So 200 or 300 years after her story becomes known and is written down, it's written down in the Acts of Paul and Thecla. We have art remembering her. We'll also take a look at, in a few minutes, Macrina the Younger. Her secret name is Thecla. Macrina is a few hundred years after Thecla. So Thecla's story becomes very important for both men and women for hundreds of years after Thecla's death. She is, we know of her from Tertullian, who in around 200 or so makes a comment that's clear he knows her story. He's frustrated that some people also know her story and are doing things based on her story that he doesn't agree with. And so he talks a little bit about her story. What you see in front of you is the cave of Thecla, the grotto of Paul, which is outside of Ephesus. It's usually not open at all to the public. But this is, if you got in, this is what you'd see. You'd see Thecla in what looks like a little house, seated at a window. You see Paul preaching. He's there in the center. And then Theoclia, who is the mother of Thecla. Her story begins as she's listening to Paul. Here's another, this now is an ivory box, casket they call it. Her story begins when she rejects marriage. She hears Paul's message, teaching on celibacy and virginity, and she decides to break off her engagement. She's a wealthy woman, and she doesn't want to, she's convicted by Paul's teaching, so she doesn't want to continue the Roman traditions of increasing elite family wealth and the various goals that the Roman society has. And so her mother turns her into the governor of the town, who decides that she should be burned at the stake. She survives that miraculously, and there's a series of other miraculous events where she's saved time and again from the arena, including being attacked by lions, but a lioness defeats the lions and other wild animals. Then the lioness herself dies. But that's often why Thecla is depicted with lions. Her story and its popularity reflects a recurring theme that women will choose a life of devotion to God over furthering their Roman family's name and fortune. Thecla is preserved by God at the very end of her life. She's living in a cave in what's now southern Turkey. She's still teaching, she's healing, there's miracles, and there's some jealous men in the town who don't like her use of this power. And so they believe that if she can be sexually assaulted, that she would lose that power. So they send some ruffians up to do that. And as they're coming into the cave, a wall in the cave opens up, and she steps through. This is how God saves her. So she's not a martyr in the typical way that we think of martyrs, but she is known as the first martyr. Following Thecla, a very famous pair, Perpetua and Felicitas. Felicitas is a slave woman, and Perpetua is a woman who has some, she's kind of like, she's wealthy, but she's not at the very top of the government. They are in Carthage. And one of the things that Perpetua and Thecla share, because they are both more high-born women, is they show the female martyr's witness that challenged Roman values, that saw the daughter as responsible for her family's honor and the continuation of the family's social standing by raising children. Perpetua denies her father's charge to come home and, forget Christianity. Perpetua keeps a diary, which we have, and many scholars today believe that it does actually represent her hand. I'm one of them. I do think it represents Perpetua's thoughts. In that, she describes 4 visions. In the first vision, she rises up a ladder to the garden above and was given cheese by the gardener, who's Jesus. Then the cheese tasted sweet. Once she told that story to the small group of other Christians who were going to be martyred, she was considered their leader. She has a total, as I said, of 4 visions. The last vision, she wrestles an Egyptian in the arena. This is her vision. And remember, the Egyptians were the archenemy of the Israelites, and so it's a very symbolic vision. The referee, if you will, in this wrestling match is Jesus. And in the wrestling match, she wins. She's victorious. What she realizes as she then is awakened from this vision is that the Christians will actually go into the arena. They will face death. Like Perpetua and Thecla, they both defy their parents. And in the story, a couple of different times, Perpetua is with her father, who begs her by the end, begs her to recant. But she says, I am a Christian. And this is a refrain that the martyrs will declare. I am a Christian. Later, Augustine will, in preaching about and writing about Perpetua, says she really wasn't defiant of her father directly per se, because that's not honoring your parents. But Augustine said she realized that her father was speaking in that role or voice of Satan, and thus must be rejected. Felicitas, who is martyred with her, is a slave woman who is pregnant. She's 8 months pregnant. She knows that if she doesn't give birth before the rest of the Christians go into the arena, she'll have to wait until after she gives birth, and then she'll go into the arena with criminals. So she doesn't want that. She wants to have an early labor and delivery. They pray for that. Their prayer is answered. And she delivers her baby the day before they go into the arena. And the guard, the male guard who is watching over her, mocks her. You think it's bad now, just wait till all the suffering you'll have in the arena. And she responds with the quote that you see there. There will be, when she's in the arena, then, there will be another inside me who will suffer for me because I'm going to suffer for him. And this is an amazing and beautiful, theologically rich picture of a woman who gives birth to a daughter, then goes into the arena the next day, knowing that Jesus will birth her again. Martyrs, the day of their death is known as their birthday. And Jesus inside of her, supporting her, suffer for me. I don't know, it's just a rich tangle of deep theology that Christians read every year on the martyr's birthday. Every year this text would be read, and her daughter was cared for then by the church, according to the document. These two, Perpetua and Felicitas, were remembered, as you see here, in very different ways, and also by Fox's Book of Martyrs, which was composed in 1563. So both Protestants and Catholics for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years remembered this story. And Augustine also giving what we might call a backhanded compliment, acknowledges their courage and even praises them to have the kind of courage that we associate with men. Now, Blandina is another slave woman who is martyred. And I want to, she's martyred in Lyon, France. I want to just point out an amazing text. As Blandina was also seen as the leader of the group, she's suspended on a stake. She's exposed there. She appears as if hanging on a cross. She inspired the combatants, that is, the other martyrs. She inspired them with great zeal, for they looked on her and beheld with their eyes, in the form of their sister, him who was crucified for them, that he might persuade those who believe on him. I have the pronoun he highlighted there because that's what we see in most English translations of Eusebius's work. She's raised up on a stake, fellow martyrs see her. They saw through her Jesus, and that in seeing Jesus, Jesus would persuade them, hang on. So I'll get a little technical here with you, but that way of translating supplies the subject of that second clause, he, or it changes the verb to an infinitive and allows then the subject to be indefinite. In other words, the Greek is ambiguous. There's no subject given for this verb to persuade. You have to infer the subject from the wider context. And in the wider context, the subject is Blandina. So what I'm suggesting and not just me, but others suggest, is it's she. They look at the form of their sister on a stake, and as they look they look at Blandina, knowing that Jesus was crucified for them, they see in Blandina Jesus. This is a slave woman hung on a stake, and the other martyrs look at her and they see Jesus. One final, and this is Blandina celebrated in a church above a doorway in a church. One final martyr. This is Saint Agnes. You can see her represented there with the lamb at her feet. She was martyred at an early age, 13, because she refused to marry a pagan. And in her story, she is also tied to a stake, but the wood wouldn't burn. The flames kept going out around her, so she finally was just beheaded by the officer. There's some other details about Agnes's life that make her influential in the church, but I'm mindful of how we need to keep moving. The martyrs' bodies were cared for. Somebody went and picked up their bodies and preserved their bones. What happened to them? Well, we have what we call bone gatherers, which are women at this time. Two of the most famous are Prudenziana and Praxedes, and you see the depiction of them from one of the cathedrals in Rome. Prudencia and her sister Praxedes were wealthy virgins, daughters of a man named Pudens. Maybe this Pudens is the one mentioned in 2 Timothy 4, verse 21, a disciple of Peter. We don't know, but it is clear that these women, that the tradition of these women is that at the risk of their own lives, they went to gather the bones. And not just them, we have stories of other women who gather the bodies of the martyrs, and often that leads to their own martyrdom. Here we have a beautiful mosaic in the Basilica di Santa Prassede, and there you see Jesus in the center, and then Peter and Paul on either side of him, and Peter and Paul have an arm around Praxedes and Prudenciana as they are presenting these women, these good saints, to Jesus. When we think about martyrdom then, I'll just toss up some key ideas where women's writings, like Perpetua's writings, and writings about women, such as what we saw with Blandina in Eusebius's work, Ecclesiastical History. The imitation of Christ is crucial. Baptism and Eucharist, that first vision, for example, that Perpetua has, is a reflection of martyrdom, of Eucharist. It's a long story how milk and cheese could be connected with Eucharist, but it is. Resurrection and incarnation, crucial, and the cosmic battle with Satan. All of these very, very important and theologically rich topics were central to the experiences of women, and men and women theologically reflected on them. In just a few minutes, we're going to gallop through a couple of more important women, including Helena, the mother of Constantine, who was herself Augusta, which is a title of like a supreme member of the royal family. Helena was involved in the construction of the Holy Sepulchre and the church on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem and the church in the Nativity in Bethlehem. For those of you who have gone to Jerusalem, you can thank Helena for the religious and liturgical topography that she helped create. She traveled to Palestine, I think she was 80, and while it was very much a religious event, it was also very much a political event, as Constantine was working to create a Christian structure and with Christian buildings in his empire. So we don't know too much about Helena, but one of the things that she is most well known for is that she discovers the true cross. This was a story that was told by the Bishop Ambrose in a funeral oration that he gave in honor of Emperor Theodosius I, so about 70 years after Helena died. It's a pretty magnificent story. But she's known as a very pious woman who, up to this day, has shaped the liturgical landscape of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. We look at Macrina the Younger, whose brothers are Gregory of Nyssa and Basil the Great. She helped her mother raise her siblings, and I put these two notes in. Gregory was willing to toss in the towel as bishop, and she said, nope, keep persevering. And Basil was pretty impressed with himself after receiving advanced education, and she took him down a peg or two. In other words, she was a good older sister. And Gregory of Nyssa writes her story in the life of Macrina, and it's a beautiful, beautiful story. He also writes a dialogue, if you will, on the soul and the resurrection, where Macrina is the teacher and Gregory is the pupil. It's modeled after Plato's dialogue, but Macrina is the teacher and Gregory is the pupil. I don't know if he wanted to if there were any bad ideas in it, well, then she got blamed because she was the teacher. I don't know if as a little brother he was trying to do that. Some people say that, I don't know. But anyway, the fact of the matter is he writes this on the soul and the resurrection with Macrina teaching. And he elsewhere, as does Basil, make clear that she is an incredibly gifted theologian who also exemplified the piety of the day. As a wealthy woman, when she chose to give away her wealth by helping others, helping the poor. She emancipated the slaves that were in her on her estate, and she did manual labor as well as read the scriptures, prayed extensively. In other words, she set up what might, I don't know if I want to say this was like an early monastic kind of, it would be similar to that if we could imagine things like that it was a community of equals living together at a time when society was so highly stratified. And she just lived out the piety that this world is not where I receive my benefits. I look to heaven. Pulcheria, a different sort of experience. Pulcheria basically ran the empire for a while. Her brother, Theodosius II, was made emperor when he was about 8 years old. She's also an older sister, and she made a lot of decisions on his behalf, especially in the area of his education, so that he grew up knowing the faith. She considered herself to be a virgin of Christ. So although, as you see on the slide, she married, it was never consummated. It was more of a political kind of thing that happened. But I want to emphasize, as she did, that she was very committed to the virginal life. What I want to emphasize is she connected with Cyril of Alexandria and the Council of Ephesus. And it's in this Council of Ephesus where they declared Mary to be the Mother of God, Theotokos, over against Nestorius. And you can see here that Pulcheria was hailed, was remembered, and appreciated for how she held to orthodoxy. She was not perfect by any means. I could tell some stories there. But she was very, very committed to theological conversation. That's what I want to drive home. She was very engaged in the cutting-edge theological conversations of the day. She did not vote at the Council of Ephesus. There were only bishops there. There were no women there. But she and Cyril of Alexandria worked hand in glove on this topic. And I'll conclude with Theodora, the empress, the wife of Justinian I. She and Justinian rebuilt Constantinople. They're responsible for the Hagia Sophia, perhaps one of the best well-known churches next to St. Peter's Basilica. And she helped underprivileged women. She was very committed to laws. She put in place laws, but she also helped, like in the city of Constantinople, providing a convent. It's called a convent of repentance, but it was across the Bosporus from Constantinople, where girls trapped in prostitution could go and live a decent life away from the struggles, the economic struggles that often drove them to prostitution, or their fathers selling them into prostitution. The Justinian laws, I think you are aware of those, strongly promoted help for the vulnerable, especially vulnerable women. She didn't get into theology very much. She may have supported the Monophysites, not the Chalcedonians. I don't need to, in other words, her focus was much more in the legal, in the practical side, as opposed to Pulcheria, who was very interested in the theological. But here we see the mosaic of Theodora. This is in San Vitale in Ravenna, and you see her carrying the chalice for the Eucharist. And she is walking to the center. And here's a broader shot of this incredible mosaic. A similar mosaic is on the other wall with her husband, similarly attired, and he is carrying the basket that holds the Eucharist bread. What we've seen is that women were courageous. In a variety of different ways, they were courageous. We've seen that women are faithful from the very beginning, with Mary saying, "May it be to me as you have said." These women are spiritual leaders in a variety of ways, from those who create things like Hagia Sophia or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, those who create laws, those who write diaries of their time in prison before their martyrdom. These women are spiritual leaders. So I'd like to close with a benediction that Professor Dr. Bruce Hindmarsh, who was for our Luce Foundation grant project, he was our mentor, Dr. Glahn, Dr. Kalantzis, and myself, our mentor. And there was a meeting that was held 2 years ago, February, where after we presented what we had done, he prayed over us, and this is part of the prayer. May you have joy in the communion of the saints, sharing in the courage of Perpetua, the presence of Christ experienced by Blandina, the innocence of Agnes, the entire consecration of Mary of Bethany, and the discipleship of Mary Magdalene. Thank you.
much. That was fantastic, and I'm sure it's raised many questions for all of us. And I welcome you to come to one of the microphones to begin or continue the conversation with Dr. Cohick. And as you're thinking of questions, perhaps I'll just start off by saying I love Thekla in having traveled through both Syria and Turkey, and I'm going to be in Turkey in a couple of weeks' time. And it is really remarkable how often you see her in lots of different settings. And some of these very important figures, like all of the ones you've mentioned, Perpetua and so on, who have just, in many ways, in the Protestant church at least, fallen out of our memory, fallen out of our traditions. The stories aren't told very often. But in those ancient churches, when you went to church, you would see them all the time. They would just be a part, kind of, when you'd see biblical depictions, you'd see Paul and you'd see Thekla right there, be right in the story. What do you think about that as maybe as something for us to recover, kind of Christian art making that revives the ancient stories?
Yeah, I think these stories of faithfulness and courage, if we think of them in that way, they're very helpful to imagine that God looks after Christians who are living in a very different place and time and have a different understanding of piety than I would today. I can learn from them. I think in the Protestants, and I'll be giving my answers, and then Beth Allison Barr, as a medievalist, can correct everything. So Beth, take a lot of notes, and then on Wednesday, you can just go right through. Cohick said this, Cohick said this, So I'm a little hesitant I'd be hesitant whether Beth was here or not, because I don't want to lead anybody astray. But my sense is that with the Protestant concern was with this notion of saint that could perhaps somehow give merit, and that was not helpful in the scheme of understanding our salvation. But if we just imagine that these are faithful Christians, men and women who faced incredible odds and God was with them, then these stories can really inspire. I think the other thing is that, as you mentioned, this is a female saint that men and women, it's not like just a saint for women. This is a female saint for the church, which meant piety could be imagined by men as being exhibited at a very high level by women. So men could practice the piety of Thekla. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think today, when we kind of have sort of pink and blue in the Western church, or at least in the American church, expressions of faithfulness, we look back at this time, the lions ate men and women. They didn't care. They did not discriminate. It tasted the same, apparently.
On that note, I would say that your reference to Aslan was a little bit hopeful. I think that the lion that helped to bury that person just ate them.
Well, according to the monk, I don't know.
Well, that's just me being cynical and making stuff up. The other question that I had to do with the artists. I mean, I know we don't know who the artists were, but presumably it was largely men who were making this kind of art. Is that correct? And so
yes.
It's not, we're talking here about the women who are courageous and saintly and so on, but as you've just said in the case of Thekla, these are presumably male artists depicting women in these important ways.
Yeah, it may be that you had women who worked alongside men in the catacombs if they were trained artists that way, because we know women did many of the same jobs that men did. Not all, like soldier, for example, but there were a number of jobs that women could do, including like weaving or making jewelry, so in that art area. So I am not aware of any inscription that identifies women as fresco artists, but I don't know that there, off the top of my head, any men either that list that in an inscription. So I wouldn't be surprised if we found an example like that of women working in art that way. With icons, I don't know enough of the history of icons to know if there were women who painted icons, but icons are a different type of art. They're not really, it's not an artistic expression. That artist is just preserving what was done. In my understanding, at least in the Eastern Orthodox Church today, you would have the men doing it. I'm unaware if women are, but I'm happy to be wrong in that.
Fascinating. Cindy, please.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Such a pleasure. I'm interested in the visual museum that you mentioned right off the top. And can you tell us more about that? What is the scope of it? How populated is it now? And is it your enviable job to travel around and take those photos?
Okay, I'll kind of try and work through all those questions. Yes, you can, and starting with the last one, yes, actually, Jim and I, my husband, we are going to go back to Italy at the end of this calendar year, late December, for 2 weeks, taking a group. We've already taken a group a year and a half ago with that, and I hope it will be a regular adventure. This project created a website, which is visualmuseum.gallery, that you can check out. And we have, I don't know, 400, 600 photographs now, but it's, the hope is to get all of them up and to have contributors send us others. We have a backlog of getting the written material up. I was just looking at a former student who had written on Praxedes and Prudenziana for the trip we took. That needs to be, it's already been approved as I've read through it, but it needs to be uploaded. And we are now on website 2.0, but when we were on website the first time, it would take maybe 4 or 5 hours just to put the pictures up, because we have a number of tags. So this website was created by 2 librarians, and it's gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous, and it's meticulous. And the spreadsheet could wrap around the earth, I don't know how many times. It's so detailed and large. We're now finally having that digitized instead of just a static spreadsheet. So that's great. We were able to get more funding to do that. And so now it may only take us maybe an hour to upload at least the picture. We've also just a week ago on our website, if you scroll down to the very bottom, you can click on becoming a contributor. If you've been traveling and have taken pictures of art, women in, let's say you've gone to Ireland or to Spain or to Ethiopia, wherever you've gone and you've been in spaces that have these, we have a contributor sheet and link where you can send us the photograph and fill out the information so that we know where you took it. I mean, you can't send us something from the Sistine Chapel because we're not allowed to take pictures of them. It has to be legal, you know. But you can take the photo and you release us to put it on our website and to have anybody download it for free. So it's one of the great things about this site is it's free for everyone. We want it to be an educational resource. So it's definitely in the building process right now, but we want as many volunteers as we can get. Either you have great pictures and you'd like us to look at them more, but or you're planning to go on a trip and you say, what could I look for? You know, so yeah, so that's, did I miss any of the questions there? Yeah, I mean, so please reach out. The Center for Women in Leadership is the umbrella organization that's over the Visual Museum. So we have a website there. I think it's leadershipwithoutapology.org. If you look at that, then it'll take you to the center. And on the center's website, that's when you'll see the Visual Museum and also the Alabaster Jar podcasts that I mentioned earlier, where you can listen to, you know, half hour, 40 minutes detail on Praxedes and Prudenziana, or Thecla, or Macrina. Many of these figures that I mentioned just so briefly, we dive in deeply. And we hope to continue maybe twice a month to have a podcast devoted to collections or specific artwork on the website. Thank you. Did you have a follow-up?
If nobody else is going to be at the microphone, I'm happy to keep chatting with you. So have you been searching out images of early Christian women throughout your experience, your career as a New Testament scholar? Or I guess I'm wondering, how have the images influenced how you understand women?
Yeah, thank you. No, I fell into this. I blame my colleague Sandra Glahn as someone who just opened the door. When I say I blame her, she's the one that drew me in, and I'm so incredibly grateful for that. Her area does a lot with liturgy and art, so she had been familiar. She had been going to Italy to many of these sites, had been seeing women depicted. I didn't get into details of particular clothing that they wore that indicated authoritative belts or collars or cloth that you fit over your hand in serving Eucharist. There's specific things that we identify with the role of bishop that we find depicted that women are wearing. And that was some things that she was noticing, because that was part of, as she was looking at liturgy. And so, and I was starting an MA in Women in Theology, and I thought, this would be great, let's take a class over. And that's in part how it happened, but she also had developed this loose grant proposal that was accepted. So that really was what jump-started it. When I would teach on, let's say, women in the Second Temple period, Jewish women in the Second Temple period, like Susanna and Judith, these are women we know of from the Apocrypha, not from the Old Testament or New Testament, but that time in between them. Judith and Susanna especially were drawn by Renaissance artists quite extensively. And I remember going through a whole lecture on Judith, and I could pick so many different pictures of how she was presented. Muscular arm, thin arm. Attractive, usually. Was her maid that came with her attractive, or an old hag? Why? She cuts off Holofernes' head. Does she hold it up? Does she hide it? The artist made all of these decisions, and it was amazing for me and the students to look at those and say, well, how does that make you feel? What do we see in the text that we hadn't seen before because we're looking at this art? So I would say that's sort of what got me interested, is the power of the art. And then, of course, looking at Thecla and martyrs, which I've studied also, that as you see how they are remembered, then I was very eager to explore that. It's not just in the text, it's not just in Augustine's sermons, for example, but it's every week when the congregation meets, and there they are, looking at them, in this brilliant mosaic. Yeah, but I still don't know what I'm talking about in terms of art history, so I have a lot of reading to do.
You were just starting to talk about what I was about to ask you about that. First of all, I love that you're doing this with both you and Sandra, but thinking about the location of these images and these paintings, and that these aren't things, when we think about them, we often see them in a museum, or we see them because we're going sightseeing to go and see this, but these are images that people lived with and they saw. And so could you maybe talk a little bit more about that, about the significance of women being so visible in these places of worship and in the center of Christian communities for so long?
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. some of the mosaics that I showed you photos of, these are in magnificent cathedrals. Ravenna was sort of the new Rome as Constantinople grew, and Rome was, sacked or depleted very much of their wealthy people. And so these were centers of political power. They were places where the emperor and empress wanted to present Christianity to the faithful. And so you have in Ravenna the 21 female martyrs and the 21 male saints, and they're both walking to Jesus at the nave. And also in Ravenna, you have Theodora and Justinian on either side, right up to where you have the altar. At this time, the altar was central for the church. That's where Jesus's body and blood was presented for you. It was the presence of Christ there. So that was the center. And so these men and women are visually moving there. So I would say that when you went to church, you were with those who had gone before. Why I started with the cloud of witnesses, I almost don't know how else to say it. It's like the women and men who had shown faithfulness were demonstrated there. You have Perpetua and Felicitas in the same area of Ravenna, in a different chapel. These medallions, they're right there with the apostles and with men who gave their lives for the faith. So there is an assumption that women can serve faithfully just like men. Now, this is not a utopian, egalitarian, small e place, right? You still have hierarchy of men and women. Pulcheria dealt with that in particular ways with the bishop that she was at odds with at times. But the altar pieces where women were there is the center of the church. I think that's what I want to emphasize. And then these shrines and these churches dedicated to Thecla are scattered throughout, as you said. It's still running in parts of Syria. At least they were before some of the violence a couple years ago, in an Aramaic area, where the Christians and the Muslims both, as friends, liked Thecla. It's just a remarkable reality. The idea of pilgrimage, which is both something men and women did, it wasn't a thing that just women did, highlights the importance in the life of piety. I mentioned that with Mary Magdalene in France, but you also have this woman, Egeria, who about maybe 50, 75 years, it's not really clear when we can date her, but late 300s, early 400s, she travels Mount Sinai and then on up through Jerusalem. She gives us a picture of the liturgical year in Jerusalem. Then she heads up to Turkey and she goes to the large site where Thecla's shrine is, and there's some women who live in that site, like what we might call nuns today, and they read the whole story of Thecla, and she worships there. And men are doing this also. They're coming to this site for respite, for renewal. So it's not just in the church on Sunday, it's also pilgrimage if you can do it, if you can afford it, and local shrines of these martyrs. Very important. So, and then the stories that are told. So it just, they lived with you. I don't know how else to say it. They lived with you. They were how you thought about your Christian life. And it's men and women. Men and women thought about Mary Magdalene as a role model. Men and women thought about Thecla as a role model.
Looks like Diane is coming to the microphone.
This really has been fascinating. One of the observations that I was quite struck by was the way you explained how those three biblical texts became conflated through the church fathers, and how through that process Mary Magdalene became seen as such a sinful woman. So this might be quite a broad question, but I'm wondering, in terms of New Testament scholarship today, do you feel like they, by and large, have we been able to recover a more accurate picture of Mary Magdalene? It seems to me in public conception, she still seems to carry those vestiges or assumptions of being a sinful woman. And I'm just wondering how you would picture her sort of more broadly.
Yes, I think that there's more scholarly consensus against the conflation, for example, of Mary Magdalene in Luke 8 with the unnamed woman in Luke 7. I think there's probably still some discussion on whether Luke's account of the anointing is of a similar enough story that it's the same story as you find in the latter chapters in the other three Gospels. So that's a possibility that in scholarship today, there might be a sense in which there's only one anointing, and Luke puts it early for whatever reason. But that, I don't know how often that is mentioned, but that wouldn't include Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene would have been pulled out by that. I think people are wondering, I don't know how many New Testament scholars are, because New Testament scholars do recognize now that women could be shopkeepers or professionals, I'll put that in scare quotes, but I mean could have a decent enough living that they could also be benefactors to Jesus, which is what she's described as by Luke. Earlier time, I think scholars couldn't imagine women earning money honestly, and so that contributed to imagining her as a prostitute. It is just a really hard, but I think scholars are pushing against this, but not here at Regent Seminary, but in certain seminaries, they're reading books 20 and 30 years old, which haven't caught up. But you all here at Regent, you're cutting edge.
Thanks
She
to our very
graduated.
good
Why are you
library.
laughing?
We need you to go to the microphone if you're going to have a question. Okay. And we're getting close to the end now, so maybe this will have to be our last question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I was just thinking about the woman depicted in Proverbs 31. You would have thought that from that description she would have been wealthy. She did everything well. She took care of her staff, and so she had the means. So if that's an Old Testament scripture, then it would not be a far leap to think that the same thing could be taking place in New Testament times and in the first century. So it would not be a stretch to believe that there were women who were also able to provide. In large part, in New Testament first century, there was a large amount of poor farmers and urban people, but it does not exclude the idea of having families with wealth. And many of them, in the women that followed after Jesus, out of their own means
That's
were
right.
supporting him. So,
No, that's absolutely right. And out of their own means, which is what Luke emphasizes. And I think in previous decades, New Testament scholars just were not open to recognizing the fact that women owned property, could make decisions, financial decisions. It wasn't, they didn't have complete access to the courts. They still had to have a guardian sign for certain things. But in other ways, they could make business decisions, and they could own property. They could own date groves. They could have money that was available for them to spend, not something that needed to have their husband's approval. It was their money. So I think as we're understanding that, as we're seeing that reality, we're starting to recognize the possibilities that when Luke says Mary Magdalene was a benefactor, he was just describing the way the world was at that time. And in the 1800s and 1900s, I think scholarship just was not open to seeing that possibility, but now we are. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think we'll call things to a close at that point. Thank you so much, Lynn. Please join me again in thanking Dr. Cohick. Friends, thanks so much for coming this evening. Just a couple of reminders as you leave. One is that there's a donation box there. If you'd like to make a contribution as you leave, you'd be most welcome to do that. Or you could go to the website, rgnt.net/give, and you can make a contribution there if you'd like to support these evening events. Also, if you would like to remember this lecture and share it with other people, it will be available soon on Regent's YouTube channel, YouTube/Regent-College. You'll have to find this there in a few days' time, so have a look at that. And then, other than that, just to say that Lynn will be available in the bookstore forthwith. So thank you all for coming. We'll see you again. Good night.